Hi, everybody. I'm Dennis Prager. You can watch now on the Salem News Channel. You can watch my show, and you can watch my guests. In this case, Eugene Kontorovich, professor of law at George Mason University. Professor, it is a pleasure to meet you and see you.
Dennis, it's a great pleasure to be on the show. Your book, Rabbi Tugushkin, had a really big impact on the life of my family, and it's great to be on the show now.
Means a lot to me. Thank you, sir. Well, you're a kindred spirit. I mean, when I think about what you've worked on, like the lockdowns and Israel, and I'd like to note to everyone that Professor Kontorovich has an extremely powerful video up this week at the PragerU video. I want to get the title exact. Does Israel occupy the West Bank? Just take 5 minutes, my friends, to look at history, which is not what is done in most universities. Are you an outlier at George Mason?
At George Mason University Law School is unusual. George Mason University.
Hold on, we have an echo. We have an echo here. I'm sorry. I feel bad, Professor.
It's not me, is it?
I have no idea what it is. But all right, continue. Let's see if something happened.
George Mason University Scalia Law School is a unusual law school in that it's actually committed to intellectual.
No. All right, we okay. This is, folks, my listeners know this drives me out of my mind. Do we have any idea why this is happening, Sean? I know, Sean, you're not involved, but do we have any idea? Is the volume up on your end? Is that possible to hear me?
It is. I can hear you well.
I know, but when you speak is the problem, not when I speak.
Okay, is this better?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
I'm sorry. Yes.
No problem. So as I was saying, the George Mason University Scalia Law School is an unusual law school. I'm going to in that it's actually committed to intellectual diversity, not just skin color diversity. And so you have professors of all sorts of viewpoints.
Right.
But certainly in the legal academy, it's unusual. There's a consensus, and there's a self-policing consensus about Israel and international law. I can tell you when I was speaking at a conference in Amsterdam, and I was invited to speak, and the organizers of the conference were faced with a boycott by other speakers who were afraid of legitimizing my views. And I said, in academia, if you think somebody's views are illegitimate, you come and you argue with them. Why don't you do that? But they wanted to deplatform. So the reason there's a consensus in academia, I think, is not because everyone thinks the same. It's because people who don't think the same are systematically deplatformed or denied access.
I had a feeling that George Mason was different because we've had so many professors from George Mason on my show during my career. What goes with George Mason? Why? I don't know much about your university. I only know that if I want a professor who is not woke, I will first look to George Mason. Why is that?
So I think there's a misconception that George Mason is a conservative school. It's not. It's a school that hires without adherence to ideology.
Right. That's fine.
And as a result, it becomes a sanctuary in a sense for top scholars who could not perhaps find positions elsewhere where there are in fact ideological litmus tests. And I think that's one of the things that makes Scalia Law School unique.
Is this a result of the president of George Mason, or you think that if the president retired, it would continue?
So George Mason Law School is part of George Mason University, and like many law schools, it's not so directly under the auspices of the main university. So I think it has to do with a series of great deans of the law school.
Well, I do salute your school. So you wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal about the concept of essential workers and the sort of, if not absurdity, the randomness about the choices, so that bar workers were essential, for example. I want to come to that when we return. I do want to restate that Professor Kantorovich has an extremely significant video up this week at prageru.com, and it is the question of, does Israel occupy the West Bank? All right, back with Professor Eugene Kantorovich. Does Israel occupy the West Bank is his video, and he's active as well in the pages of the Wall Street Journal. He's a professor of law at George Mason University. I hope we've cleared up the sound issues, for which I can only say to my viewers and listeners, I am embarrassed. I don't know why these things happen, but they do. So, Professor, you wrote about, in the Wall Street Journal just last month, about this notion of who are essential workers, people allowed to work and people who would be locked down. But in general, I would like to know, what is your take, if you have any, on the legality? I won't even speak about necessarily the medical efficacy of the lockdowns, the legality.
The lockdowns were emergency measures taken under emergency authority that governors do have. And it's important that governments have emergency powers in the case of tornadoes, floods, etc., to make sure people stay inside for a few days. But this was something entirely different than that kind of natural disaster. And we see immediately the power to lock down, which the government may indeed have, is nothing compared to the even greater power of locking down and then deciding who gets out. And that's a really huge power, because the lockdowns were in fact not lockdowns. They were selective lockdowns. There were restrictions on Americans who were deemed unimportant or unessential by the government. It's one thing to say there's floods outside everybody needs to stay inside for a few days. It's another to have an extended period of time where people can go outside, can pursue their callings based on whether their jobs are on a list. And that's a power that's been unprecedented. And I'll say, beyond the legal question, it's really fascinating where this idea even came from. Because if you read the pandemic preparedness plans that the federal government prepared before this pandemic, anticipating another 1918 flu or other catastrophe, in those plans, which were preparing for disasters with millions dead, things far worse than COVID, the possibility of a lockdown is not even mentioned. Indeed, what they say is maybe it would be appropriate to have what they call snow days, 1 or 2 days of closure, but that would be too economically and socially costly. So it's a radical measure, but then in particular, enforcing that measure unequally is what I think raises real legal problems of equal protection and fundamental liberties. Because in fact, not everybody's locked down.
Why hasn't this gone to court in 2 years?
So I'll tell you, what it has gone to court. There have been many challenges to lockdowns, and most of them were rejected out of hand by courts for a couple reasons. One, in the first few months of the pandemics, the government could do no wrong. Right? Courts were rejecting everything. There's a COVID. We're very scared. But that started dying down, and courts started becoming more open-minded. But there's a Supreme Court case called Lochner, Lochner versus New York, which held that people have a fundamental right to work and pursue their profession and provide for themselves, and the government has a limited ability to interfere with that. During the New Deal, the Supreme Court overruled the Lochner, and the idea of a constitutional right to be able to work freely became a boogeyman. In constitutional law, when you say Lochner, that's like the bad old pre-New Deal world. Now, and I think, and I've written about this in an article called Lochner Under Lockdown, one reason that the idea of a right to work became less important, and on the other hand, rights to all sorts of sexual autonomy became more important, is I think it became, most people came to believe that the government would never very broadly interfere with people's right to work. Like say, you guys can work and you guys can't. Or bar entire classes of professions from pursuing their livelihood. Now, during the COVID pandemic, that's exactly what happened. Right? That's exactly what happened. The government said, You guys, restaurant owners, you can't work. You guys who sell marijuana in a dispensary, you can work.
Right. So that's my question. How could this be 2 years later? How is this possible? Why aren't people suing left and right?
People are suing, and it's what I would call a fluke of constitutional law. There have been lawsuits about COVID restrictions as applied to lots of things: religion, abortion, Second Amendment rights, and all of those suits are sometimes successful. But when you sue for something even bigger, just the liberty to leave your house and work at your job, that ironically is not considered a constitutional right, which I think is a bit perverse because without the ability to support yourself, of course, right, there's no point in a right to free speech. You can't buy a newspaper. Right, there's no point in a right to bear arms because you can't purchase a firearm. So the right that is in fact more fundamental, and if you ask people what's important to them, is it really to be able to watch like the gossip columnists on the news, or is it to be able to meet with their family and go to work?
So I will pose a radical question as we come to the end, and I'd love to do this again with you. Seeing the suppression, the irrational suppression of liberty in this country for 2 years, I am now prepared to remove all emergency powers from all governors as a matter of law. If there is a flood, people will stay home because they don't want to drown. I am willing to risk people drowning in a flood because they did something stupid, rather than have what we now have had.
Yeah, certainly I think this was an overreach of emergency powers of unparalleled
Right,
proportion.
but when there is an overreach, then maybe the power itself is the problem.
No, I think we see this in a few areas. We see one of the most shocking abuses of government powers in the pandemic is now the remedies for COVID, monoclonal antibodies, one of the most effective treatments, are being apportioned on a racial basis.
Right.
So that many states say if you can get the monoclonal antibodies if you're very old and very sick, or an ethnic minority.
I have to keep you on because I have to get more clarity, which you provide, Professor Kantorovich of George Mason Law School. It's a very important man I'm speaking to, Professor Eugene Kantorovich, who is a professor of law at the George Mason Law School. Professor, as bad as things are in this country, and I am, as I said, for the removal of all emergency powers from governors, it's so obvious that you don't even have to comment on this. I don't want to put you on in a political arena, but every Democrat will abuse this by definition, and they have. But America is a bastion of freedom compared to Israel and Europe. Nobody other than Sweden has taken liberty seriously. Has this disturbed you?
What's happening in many countries has disturbed me. But what we've seen is every country overreacts in its own way. So in some ways, Israel has very draconian rules restricting, for a long time, restricting people from traveling in and out of the country, even leaving the country or coming in. On the other hand, Israel never had a vaccine mandate. You were never sort of put at risk of your job or civic participation.
Oh, that's interesting.
In Europe, everyone has their own meshugas, as we say in Yiddish. Everyone goes crazy in their own way. But what we see, and it's very important in the United States, that the largest federal mandate was struck down by the Supreme Court last week, which was a very important case. Biden's OSHA mandate applied to most American workers. What's happening in many European countries is people who are unvaccinated are being excluded from public life. And you see this also in places like New York, and it's quite extraordinary. And I say, as a legal matter, I think there's precedent for states being able to require vaccinations in many cases. I think in the case of COVID, that argument's becoming increasingly arbitrary, as the vaccine that they're proposing to give people is a vaccine for a different virus. And so today, when they're pushing vaccines on people, it's a vaccine that was made for a different virus. That seems completely arbitrary. But the leading case that in America on which this whole authority to vaccinate people is based on is called Jacobson versus Massachusetts. And it said that the state of Massachusetts could require that people either be vaccinated or get a $5 fine. It's about $160 today. So that doesn't provide for the authority of the state to compulsorily vaccinate people. It provides the authority to give you a parking ticket if you do something the state is obnoxious.
All right.
But today, people's participation in public life is being conditioned on it.
All right. We're going to have to do a part two. I thank you. I urge my listeners and viewers to watch the professor in the latest PragerU video. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dennis, so much for that. Great pleasure.